My late wife, Caroline, left behind a sapphire necklace that was the only physical piece of her soul I had left to hold onto. When I could not find it on her memorial shelf, my daughter looked me dead in the eye and said she sold it because she needed the cash for a vacation. When I finally tracked down the pawn shop to try to get the necklace back, the owner said something that froze the blood in my veins. He said, "Sir, you will not believe what we found when we opened the medallion on the pendant." I did not even know it opened. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Victor Caldwell. I am 70 years old, a retired civil engineer, and I live in a quiet upscale suburb of Chicago. I spent 40 years of my life building commercial bridges, managing cutthroat contractors, and pouring every ounce of my sweat into providing a rock-solid foundation for my family. I provided everything so my daughter could have a perfect life. My wife Caroline passed away exactly 1 year ago. When she died, a massive part of my world collapsed. We had built a beautiful life together, and the house we lived in was a testament to our decades of hard work and sacrifice. But the only thing I truly cherished, the only thing that brought me comfort in the darkest hours of my grief, was a delicate gold necklace with a brilliant blue sapphire pendant. I bought it for Caroline on our 20th anniversary, and she wore it every single day until her last breath. I kept the necklace in a small faded velvet box on a dedicated memorial shelf in my master bedroom right next to her favorite photograph. Every morning I would wake up, walk over to that shelf, and gently trace my fingers over the velvet. It was a silent ritual, a private way to say good morning to the woman who had been my partner in absolutely everything. But this particular Tuesday morning, the routine was brutally shattered. I reached out to touch the box, and my fingers met empty wood. I blinked, rubbing my tired eyes, thinking maybe I had moved it to clean the shelf. I opened the small wooden drawer beneath the shelf. It was empty. Panic, cold and sharp, began to spread through my chest like a poison. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the dull ache in my old joints, and began frantically searching the floor. I pulled up the edges of the heavy wool rug. I tore the thick comforter off the bed, throwing pillows across the room. My breathing grew ragged and uneven. I emptied the nightstand drawers, dumping old receipts, pens, and reading glasses onto the carpet. I checked the bathroom vanity, the closet shelves, even the pockets of my own coats. I spent 2 agonizing hours tearing my own sanctuary apart. The necklace was simply gone. My mind raced through every logical scenario. We lived in a very safe neighborhood. There were no broken windows, no forced entry, no signs of a break-in. The alarm system had been armed all night. The only people who had the security code, the only people who ever came in and out of my house freely, were my daughter Brittany and her husband Derek. Just as I was sitting on the edge of my ruined bed, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart, I heard the heavy oak front door swing open downstairs. I heard the familiar sharp sound of Brittany's designer high heels clicking against the hardwood floor, followed by Derek's heavy footsteps. They were laughing loudly. The sound of their carefree joy felt like sandpaper against my raw nerves. I slowly pushed myself up, walked out into the hallway, and leaned against the banister to look down into the foyer. They were standing by the kitchen island, dropping several large, glossy shopping bags from high-end designer stores onto the marble countertop. The marble countertop that I had paid for. Brittany was holding up a pair of expensive sunglasses, admiring her reflection in the hall mirror. Derek was typing on his latest smartphone, a smug, relaxed expression resting on his face. I walked down the stairs, every single step feeling like I was carrying 100 pounds of lead on my shoulders. I approached the kitchen, my hands trembling slightly by my sides. Brittany looked up, completely ignoring the absolute devastation written all over my face. "Oh, hey, Dad," she said casually, tossing the sunglasses into her expensive leather purse. "We just went downtown to grab a few things for the trip." The traffic on the expressway was an absolute nightmare today. I did not care about the traffic. I did not care about her new sunglasses or her shopping bags. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice trembling with a mixture of intense fear and rising anger. "Brittany, where is your mother's sapphire necklace?" The velvet box is completely gone from the memorial shelf in my bedroom. I expected her to look confused. I expected her to drop what she was doing and help me look for it. I expected her to show even a fraction of the panic and heartache I was feeling. Instead, she just sighed, rolling her eyes, as if I had just asked her a mildly annoying question about the weather. She leaned against the kitchen counter, crossed her arms defensively, and dropped the bomb that would completely shatter my reality. I sold it. "Dad," she said, her tone completely flat, completely devoid of any empathy or guilt. "We needed the cash for our trip to Cabo this weekend." I stared at her. The words hit my ears, but my brain absolutely refused to process them. My own daughter, my flesh and blood. She had walked into my private bedroom, taken the most sacred, irreplaceable possession I owned, the last physical memory of her dead mother, and sold it to a stranger just to fund a vacation. "You what?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the roaring sound rushing through my ears. "I sold it," she repeated, sounding incredibly annoyed that she had to explain herself to me. "Dad, we really needed the money. Derek and I have been so stressed out lately. We booked this weekend getaway to Cabo to relax, but we were a little short on spending money. Mom is gone. She does not need a piece of metal gathering dust on a shelf. It is just a necklace. It is just a necklace." The callousness of her words felt like a physical blow to my chest. My jaw dropped. I looked at Derek, expecting him to step in, expecting him to show some kind of shame or remorse for letting his wife do something so utterly despicable. But Derek just stood there, leaning against the refrigerator, examining his perfectly manicured nails. He did not even have the decency to look me in the eye. My chest tightened painfully. The room started to spin around me. I grabbed the edge of the granite countertop just to keep myself from collapsing onto the floor. The sheer disrespect, the absolute disregard for my grief and my personal boundaries was suffocating. I opened my mouth to scream, to demand she give the money back right this second, to kick them both out of my house forever. But my lungs felt like they were filled with wet cement. I was a 70-year-old man staring at the cold, heartless monsters I had somehow allowed into my life, and for the first time in 40 years, I could not find the air to speak. When I finally found my voice, it did not sound like my own. It was a guttural roar tearing out of my chest. "How could you?" I demanded, gripping the granite island until my knuckles turned white. "That was your mother's necklace. It was not yours to take or sell. You stole from me. You stole from her memory." Brittany did not flinch. She did not lower her gaze in shame. Instead, her face twisted into a mask of pure indignation. She dropped her heavy purse onto the counter with a loud thud. "Stole," she repeated, her voice dripping with venom. "Are you seriously accusing your own daughter of being a thief? You have thousands sitting in retirement accounts, Dad. You have a massive house. You have everything. I took one little piece of jewelry no one was using. It was just sitting in the dark." "It was not just sitting there," I shot back, stepping forward. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at that box every morning. It was the only thing I had left that still smelled like her. "How much did you get for it? How much was your mother's memory worth to you?" That was the exact moment Brittany changed tactics. I had seen her do this 100 times as a teenager, but I never thought she would dare use it now over something this profoundly sacred. Her defensive expression melted away. Her lower lip began to tremble. Her eyes filled with rapid tears, spilling perfectly over her cheeks. She let out a shaky sob, covering her face with manicured hands. "You care more about a dusty piece of metal than my mental health?" she cried, her voice cracking with manufactured devastation. "You have no idea what I have been going through. I have been severely depressed since Mom died. I cannot sleep or eat. I cry every single night. Derek and I have been drowning in stress trying to take care of you, and you cannot even spare a simple vacation for your only daughter." She leaned heavily against the counter, sobbing into her palms. I stood there completely stunned by the sudden emotional whiplash. My anger, which had been burning so fiercely just seconds before, suddenly collided with a wave of deep paternal instinct. She was crying. My little girl was crying, telling me she was broken by the same grief that was slowly killing me. "Do you know how hard it is to walk into this house and see her ghost everywhere?" Brittany wailed, pointing a shaking finger at the stairs. I needed to get away. I needed to see the ocean and breathe for a few days so I would not completely lose my mind. But fine. If you love that necklace more than you love my sanity, then go ahead and call the police. Send your own daughter to jail. She buried her face in Derek's chest. Derek wrapped his thick arms around her, stroking her hair with exaggerated tenderness. He looked at me over her shoulder, his expression perfectly arranged into a mask of solemn disappointment. He let out a long, heavy sigh, acting like the reasonable adult in a room full of children. "Victor, please calm down," Derek said softly, his voice smooth and incredibly condescending. "Look at what you are doing to her. She is fragile right now. We just wanted her to heal. I told her we should ask you for the money first, but she was so afraid you would say no. She was afraid you would judge her for needing a break. Do not blow this out of proportion. It is just a material object. You still have your memories of Caroline. No one can take those away from you." I stared at the two of them. My brain felt like it was trapped in a thick, suffocating fog. They were twisting reality, spinning my entirely justified outrage into an irrational, selfish attack on my grieving daughter. Derek's calm, steady voice was like poison dripping slowly into my ear. He made it sound so completely logical. He made it sound like I was the villain for being angry that my dead wife's most precious possession had been pawned off for a few days of sunshine and margaritas. "But we will get it back," Derek added, his tone dripping with false reassurance. "We will go to Cabo, Brittany. We'll finally get the rest she desperately needs. And when we come back, I will work overtime. We will save up the money, go back to the jeweler, and buy the necklace back for you. We promise. You have my word as a man, Victor." I looked at Brittany, who was still weeping softly against Derek's shirt. She was the only family I had left in this entire world. If I pushed this, if I demanded they leave, I would be completely and utterly alone in this massive empty house. I would lose the last living connection I had to Caroline. The thought of that absolute isolation terrified me more than the betrayal. The wet cement in my lungs hardened. I felt a crushing weight press down on my shoulders, bowing my posture. I was so tired. I was just a grieving old man who did not have the strength to fight a war against his own child. "Fine," I whispered, my voice hollow and utterly defeated. I looked down at the hardwood floor, unable to meet their eyes anymore. "Just go on your trip. Go to Cabo. But when you get back, I want that necklace returned to this house. Do you understand me?" Brittany sniffled, wiping her eyes and nodding weakly. "Thank you, Dad," she murmured. I turned around and walked slowly up the wooden stairs, leaving them standing in the kitchen. I swallowed my rage, forcing myself to accept their twisted logic, desperately hoping that my daughter was telling the truth. I stood perfectly still in the center of the kitchen, listening to the heavy thud of their designer shoes moving toward the front entryway. Brittany was already complaining about the upcoming flight, her voice completely devoid of the agonizing sorrow she had projected just moments before. Derek murmured something in response, his voice casual. I turned my head slowly, looking into the hallway. We had a large antique mirror hanging by the front door, positioned perfectly so you could check your coat before stepping into the cold. As Derek reached for the brass doorknob, he paused. He glanced up, making direct eye contact with his own reflection in that mirror. From where I stood in the kitchen, I had a clear, unobstructed view of his face. His expression sent a violent, freezing jolt straight down my spine. He was not looking at a man burdened by crippling grief. He was looking like a victor. A slow, chilling smirk crept across his lips. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph, the arrogant satisfaction a con artist wears when they successfully swindle their mark. He adjusted his expensive collar, patted Brittany on the back, and guided her out the door. The heavy oak slammed shut, plunging my house back into a suffocating silence. I remained rooted to the floor. The image of Derek's smirk burned into my mind, illuminating the dark corners of the interaction we just had. For 40 years, I worked as a civil engineer managing massive construction projects across the ruthless skyline of Chicago. My entire career was built on identifying structural flaws, uncovering hidden liabilities, and seeing right through smooth-talking contractors who tried to sell cheap materials at a premium price. I made a living by trusting my gut when a blueprint did not add up. Right now, my gut was screaming so loudly, it was practically deafening. I walked back up the stairs and stood in my bedroom, staring at the empty space on Caroline's memorial shelf. I forced my emotions aside and examined the situation with cold logic. If Brittany had truly acted out of spontaneous grief, if she just desperately needed a quick escape to Mexico, her actions would have been messy. But this was not messy. This was a surgical strike. My house is filled with valuable items. We have an extensive collection of vintage silverware in the dining room. There are high-end electronics in the den. I have expensive watches sitting right on my dresser. But they bypassed all of those bulky, traceable items. They walked past the things that would take time to sell and went directly for the one item that possessed maximum value, minimal size, and immediate liquidity. A gold and sapphire necklace can be slipped into a pocket and turned into thousands of dollars of untraceable cash in minutes. That level of precision requires forethought. It requires a cold, calculating mindset that completely contradicts the image of a weeping, emotionally unstable daughter needing a sudden beach vacation. Then I started pulling apart the Cabo story itself. It was fundamentally flawed. Derek earns a very comfortable salary. Brittany has premium credit cards. When affluent young couples book a weekend getaway to a resort in Cabo, they put it on a credit card. They earn travel miles. They leave a digital paper trail without a second thought. They absolutely do not pawn a stolen family heirloom for untraceable cash to pay for a simple vacation. You only need a thick stack of untraceable cash when you are doing something you desperately need to hide. You need cash when you are running, when you are trying to bypass the banking system, or when you are paying for something highly illegal. The air in my bedroom suddenly felt very thin. My mind raced backward, connecting minor details I had brushed off as insignificant over the past few weeks. Derek changing the subject whenever I asked about his job. Brittany constantly checking her phone with a nervous, frantic energy. The strange, secretive whispers I caught them sharing when they thought I was asleep in my armchair. They were not going to Cabo to drink margaritas on a beach. That entire narrative was a carefully constructed smokescreen designed to placate a grieving old man. Derek's smirk was the absolute proof. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought I was too blinded by my love for my daughter to see the massive gaping holes in the foundation of their lie. A hot, searing wave of adrenaline flooded my veins, washing away the exhaustion and the despair that had weighed me down moments before. I was 70 years old, but I was far from senile. I refused to sit in this empty house and play the role of the oblivious, tragic father while my own flesh and blood played me for a fool. If they were lying about the vacation, I needed to know exactly what they were actually funding with my dead wife's memory. I needed to see what they were hiding behind the closed doors of their own home. I turned away from the empty memorial shelf and marched straight downstairs to the coat closet. I pulled my heavy winter jacket off the hanger and shoved my arms into the sleeves. I grabbed my car keys from the ceramic bowl on the entryway table. The metal keys felt cold and sharp against my palm, a grounding physical anchor in a reality that was rapidly spiraling out of control. They said their flight was not until tomorrow morning. That meant they were likely heading back to their house right now to pack their bags or finish whatever illicit preparations they had started. I opened my front door and stepped out into the biting Chicago wind. I was going to follow them. I was going to tear down their smokescreen piece by piece and uncover the rot hiding underneath, regardless of how much it was going to actually hurt me deep down inside. The drive to their neighborhood usually took 20 minutes. But today, the familiar streets of the Chicago suburbs blurred together in a gray, freezing rush. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my old sedan so tightly that my knuckles ached with a dull, throbbing pain. Every logical part of my brain, the part that had spent decades calculating structural stress loads and load-bearing capacities, was screaming at me to turn the car around immediately. It warned me that peeling back this specific layer of deception would only bring my entire world crashing down upon my shoulders. But I simply could not stop the momentum of my own terrifying realization. I thought about the empty velvet box on the memorial shelf. I thought about Caroline and the way her smile used to light up our home. I had to know what was real and what was a fabricated, toxic illusion designed to keep me docile. I finally turned into their pristine, impeccably manicured subdivision. The large, modern colonial houses sat perfectly spaced apart along the curving road, projecting an absolute image of total serenity and boundless generational wealth. I pulled up to the curb a few houses down from theirs, parking completely in the deep shadow of a large barren oak tree. I sat in the idling vehicle for a long moment, staring silently at their grand front door. It was a beautiful, sprawling home that should have been a point of immense, unwavering pride for me. Just 3 years ago, I had willingly liquidated a very significant portion of my hard-earned life savings to hand them an 80% cash down payment. I wanted my daughter to have the financial security I had worked so tirelessly to achieve over 40 years. I wanted her to feel absolutely safe in a very unpredictable world. Instead, looking at the facade of that house right now, it only felt like a towering monument to my own foolish, pathetic gullibility. I stepped out of the car, pulling the collar of my heavy winter coat tight around my chest to block out the bitter, biting wind. I walked up the long, perfectly paved driveway, my boots making little sound. Both of their expensive luxury cars were presumably parked inside the closed, insulated garage, but the massive front windows of the main house were completely dark. I climbed the stone front steps and firmly pressed the glowing doorbell. The melodic chime echoed faintly inside, ringing through the seemingly empty, cavernous halls. I waited there, listening closely. Absolutely nothing happened. I knocked on the heavy wooden door with my bare fist, the sound sharp, loud, and demanding. Still, there was no movement, no footsteps approaching the foyer, no sign of life anywhere within the primary residence. They had to be here somewhere. I had just seen them leave my own house only 20 minutes earlier, and they had explicitly stated they were heading home to frantically pack for their supposed flight to Mexico. My instincts, thoroughly and painfully awakened, now told me they were actively ignoring the front door on purpose. I stepped off the porch and walked around the side of the sprawling house. The ground was slick with frozen dew, the dry, dead grass crunching very softly under the heavy soles of my winter boots. I moved carefully, keeping my physical distance from the lower floor windows, until I eventually reached the side of the massive attached 3-car garage. There was a narrow, horizontally rectangular frosted window installed along the red brick wall of the garage structure. It was designed to let in natural daylight without compromising privacy, but the bottom pane was currently cracked open just a few small inches to let the freezing outside air circulate indoors. I crept closer, pressing my back flat against the cold, abrasive brick, and slowly, very cautiously, leaned my head toward the small opening. The low, aggressive, mechanical grinding sound hit my ears before I even managed to look inside the room. It was a relentless, hungry noise that instantly set my nerves completely on edge. I carefully angled my vision to peer straight through the narrow, open gap. The sprawling garage was brightly illuminated by long, harsh fluorescent ceiling bulbs. Derek was standing right in the absolute center of the smooth concrete floor, completely stripped of his usual composed, highly arrogant demeanor. His expensive, custom-tailored designer jacket was thrown carelessly onto the dusty hood of his luxury sports car. His silk tie was violently loosened. His stiff collar was unbuttoned, and a visible sheen of panicked sweat coated his pale forehead. He was standing directly over a heavy-duty industrial-grade paper shredder, the specific high-capacity kind you normally only see inside major corporate accounting offices. Next to him, stacked precariously high on a cheap plastic folding table, were massive, disorganized piles of thick manila folders and heavily bound financial ledgers. My breath literally hitched in my throat as I stood there and watched him work with a feverish, terrifying intensity. He was not just tossing away old junk mail or expired credit card offers from the mail. He was frantically feeding thick, heavy stacks of what looked exactly like official bank statements, detailed legal contracts, and deeply personal family documents directly into the grinding metal teeth of the greedy machine. His physical movements were jerky, intensely desperate, and completely erratic. He grabbed another thick, bursting folder from the table, ripped it open with shaking hands, and forcefully shoved the entire contents straight into the narrow slot. The powerful shredder groaned and whined loudly under the sheer, overwhelming volume of the paper, churning the crucial documents into meaningless white confetti that spilled rapidly into an enormous, heavy black garbage bag. You do not panic and shred evidence for a vacation. I leaned closer, desperately straining my eyes to read the printed logos. Suddenly, my heavy winter boot shifted on the icy ground. A brittle twig snapped. Derek slowly turned around. Suddenly, my heavy winter boot shifted on the icy ground. A brittle twig snapped. Derek slowly turned around. The loud mechanical grinding of the paper shredder abruptly stopped. The sudden silence in the freezing winter air was completely deafening. I froze, pressing my entire body as hard as I possibly could against the rough brick of the garage wall. I held my breath, squeezing my eyes shut for a fleeting second, praying that the deep afternoon shadows cast by the neighboring roofline would conceal my dark winter coat. My heart was hammering a violent, erratic rhythm against my ribs, sounding so incredibly loud in my own ears that I was certain Derek could hear it echoing through the frosted glass. I heard the heavy thud of his leather shoes walking slowly across the smooth concrete floor, moving directly toward the narrow, cracked window. I squeezed myself tighter against the wall, wishing I could simply melt into the brickwork. A shadow passed over the frosted pane, blocking out the harsh fluorescent light from inside. Derek was standing mere inches away from me, separated only by a thin layer of glass and freezing Chicago air. I remained absolutely motionless. My old aching joints screamed in protest against the unnatural posture, and the biting wind whipped right through my collar. For what felt like an absolute eternity, Derek simply stood there, peering out into the fading daylight. I did not dare to exhale. I focused entirely on the microscopic details of the frozen mortar inches from my nose. Then he finally exhaled a long, heavy breath. He muttered a quiet curse under his breath, probably attributing the noise to a stray animal. The dark shadow moved away from the glass. A few seconds later, the aggressive whine of the industrial paper shredder roared back to life, chewing through another massive stack of highly sensitive documents. I slowly let out the breath I had been holding, a quiet, shaky cloud of white mist escaping my lips. My knees felt dangerously weak, trembling slightly from the massive surge of adrenaline. I knew I could not stay in this exact spot. It was far too exposed. I carefully inched my way backward along the wall, moving toward the side entrance of the main house. Right near the back corner, positioned conveniently out of sight from the street, sat 3 large, heavy-duty plastic garbage bins. I silently positioned myself behind their massive dark frames, crouching down low to stay hidden. From this new vantage point, I was practically invisible, but I was also located right next to the slightly ajar window of their luxurious kitchen. I huddled there in the bitter cold, rubbing my stiff hands together. What was Derek shredding? Why were they acting with such calculated desperation? My dark, spiraling thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a voice drifting clearly through the cracked kitchen window. It was Brittany. Her voice was not the weak, trembling, tearful whisper she had used just an hour ago in my foyer, when she claimed she was drowning in insurmountable grief. It was sharp, cold, completely commanding, and strictly businesslike. "Listen to me very carefully," Brittany said, her tone dripping with intense, arrogant impatience. "I do not care what the daily transfer limit is. You need to push it through. Wire the rest of the funds to the offshore account today. We do not have time to wait for the weekend delays." I knelt perfectly still in the freezing shadows, my hands gripping the frozen plastic edge of the garbage bin. Offshore accounts. My daughter, who barely understood how to balance a basic checking account when she lived under my roof, was aggressively demanding an immediate wire transfer to a foreign bank. There was a brief pause as the person on the other end of the line presumably responded. Brittany let out a harsh, mocking laugh that sent a sickening chill straight down my spine. "No," she scoffed, her voice filled with absolute contempt. "The old man has absolutely no clue. He actually bought the stupid depression story. He thinks we are going to a beach resort to drink margaritas and heal our broken hearts. He will just sit in that big empty house mourning my mother while we finalize everything on our end. He is completely harmless." A sharp physical pain shot directly through the center of my chest. It felt exactly like a knife twisting brutally into my ribs. The old man. That was what my only child, my own flesh and blood, called me when I was not around. The daughter I had provided everything for viewed my deep, agonizing grief over her mother as nothing more than a convenient weakness she could exploit. Brittany paused again, listening to the phone. Then she delivered the final crushing blow. "Yes, that is perfect," she confirmed, her voice ringing crisp and clear in the evening air. "Confirm the one-way tickets for tomorrow morning. Send it to the encrypted address we set up yesterday. We are leaving right after sunrise, and we are absolutely never coming back." The call abruptly ended. I heard her footsteps retreat from the kitchen, leaving me alone in the freezing silence. "One-way tickets." The words echoed repeatedly in my mind, ringing with a terrifying absolute clarity. You do not book expensive one-way tickets and massive offshore wire transfers for a weekend trip to Cabo. You do not spend hours frantically shredding detailed financial ledgers simply because you want to enjoy a few days of warm sunshine on a beach in Mexico. They were not going on a vacation. They were running. They were permanently fleeing the country, severing every single tie they had ever made. But the terrifying, unanswerable question still remained. What exactly did my daughter and son-in-law do that was so monumentally terrible, so financially catastrophic, that it required a sudden, untraceable escape across international borders? I could not let them simply vanish. I had to dig deeper. I waited completely alone in the freezing shadows for what felt like endless hours. The biting wind gnawed at my exposed face, but the adrenaline surging through my veins kept me anchored to my hiding spot behind the plastic bins. Finally, the massive garage door began to slowly rattle open. I held my breath as Derek's luxury SUV backed out onto the paved driveway. Through the tinted glass, I could barely make out Brittany sitting in the passenger seat, absorbed in her phone. They pulled out into the quiet suburban street, the red taillights quickly fading into the darkness of the Chicago evening. The moment their vehicle turned the corner and disappeared from my sight, I sprang into action. My old joints protested the sudden movement, stiff and aching from the cold, but I pushed through the physical pain. I had a very narrow window of opportunity, and I was certainly not going to waste a single precious second. I stepped out from my hiding place and turned my attention to the 3 large garbage bins lined up against the brick wall. They were the standard municipal garbage bins, tightly sealed against the harsh winter elements. I grabbed the cold plastic handle of the first bin and threw the heavy lid open. It was mostly filled with household waste, empty wine bottles, discarded food packaging, and regular household trash. I moved quickly to the second bin, ripping the lid back with frantic energy. This one was entirely different. It was full to the brim with densely packed, uniformly shredded paper. The tiny, meaningless white strips were piled high, resembling a tragic mound of artificial snow. Derek had clearly emptied the industrial shredder directly into this container. I plunged my bare hands straight into the massive pile of shredded documents. I desperately sifted through the disconnected fragments, frantically searching for anything that had somehow survived the grinding metal teeth of the machine. The sheer volume of destroyed information was absolutely staggering. What kind of legitimate life required this level of paranoid, meticulous destruction? I dug much deeper, plunging my aching arms up to the elbows in the endless sea of shredded paper. My fingers suddenly brushed against something slightly different. It was a thick, glossy clump of paper that had somehow been managed to fold over onto itself, temporarily jamming the machine just enough to preserve a few solid connected pieces. I carefully pulled the tightly wedged clump out of the bin. My heart skipped a heavy beat. It was a collection of jagged, irregularly torn strips, but they were significantly wider than the rest of the confetti. Derek must have realized the machine was jamming and forcefully pulled the document through before it could be completely pulverized. I quickly gathered every single piece of the jammed document I could find, stuffing them securely into the deep pockets of my winter coat. I closed the bin lid, ensuring everything looked exactly as I had found it, and ran back down the driveway toward my parked car. I needed light, and I needed a flat surface to work on. I reached my old sedan, unlocked the door, and immediately turned on the bright overhead interior light. I spread the jagged, torn strips of glossy paper across the flat surface of the passenger seat, my hands trembling violently from a mixture of the freezing temperature and profound anxiety. I felt like an archaeologist trying to reconstruct a shattered artifact that held the absolute key to my survival. I carefully aligned the straight printed edges, matching the distinctive black ink and the bold, official-looking blue logos. It took me several frustrating minutes to assemble the fragmented puzzle, but slowly, the terrifying, indisputable truth began to materialize right before my eyes. This was absolutely not a luxury hotel reservation for a weekend getaway to a resort in Cabo San Lucas. I stared down at the reconstructed document, my breathing growing shallow and rapid. It was a confirmed, highly detailed itinerary for a pair of one-way international first-class flights. The final destination, printed clearly on the top of the ticket, was absolutely not Mexico. It was Belize. My mind raced immediately, recalling a random conversation I had with my lawyer Harrison years ago regarding international law. Belize is a country that famously does not have an extradition treaty with the United States for financial crimes. You do not book a one-way flight to a non-extradition country to relieve emotional stress. You go there to hide forever. I looked closer at the second reconstructed page. It was a paid commercial receipt from a massive global freight company. They had successfully secured a 40-foot shipping container scheduled to depart from a private port facility in exactly 2 days. They were not just taking a vacation. They were packing up their entire lives and abandoning me without a single word of warning. They were taking the money they had stolen and vanishing into the wind. The absolute crushing weight of my daughter's betrayal slammed heavily into my chest, threatening to completely suffocate me. She was leaving me to die alone in my grief, while she escaped with her arrogant, smirking husband. But a massive void remained in the center of this horrific puzzle. Why were they running so abruptly? What exactly had they done that required a secret flight to Belize and the paranoid shredding of their financial history? I stared blankly at the torn paper, searching for an invisible answer. Then the realization hit me like a physical blow. The necklace. Brittany had sold Caroline's sapphire necklace just hours before finalizing their escape. They needed untraceable cash, but more importantly, that necklace was the initial catalyst for this entire nightmare. I had to track down that specific pawn shop immediately, regardless of the time or cost. I had to retrieve my dead wife's precious sapphire necklace to see if it somehow held the missing clue to their terrifying permanent flight away from Chicago. I sat quietly in the dark, freezing interior of my old parked sedan for several agonizing hours. The warm, glowing windows of the surrounding colonial homes went dark one by one. I waited patiently until the glowing digital clock on my dashboard finally read 2 in the morning. The quiet suburban street was now completely deserted, tightly wrapped in a heavy blanket of deep, uninterrupted winter silence. I knew from years of managing job sites that desperation requires cold, calculated action. Derek and Brittany were permanently abandoning their lives, but they certainly would not leave loose ends inside their locked house. If Derek kept the pawnshop receipt, he undoubtedly tossed it somewhere he rarely looked. He had a secondary car, a 5-year-old sedan used exclusively for his commute. It was parked outside right in the corner of their sprawling driveway, completely exposed to the elements. That was my target. I reached into the passenger footwell and retrieved a heavy steel center punch from my old leather tool bag. I carried that tool for decades on job sites. It was incredibly effective at shattering tempered safety glass with silent precision. I slipped the heavy tool into my coat pocket. I pulled thick leather work gloves over my freezing hands to ensure a solid grip. I stepped out of my car and closed the door with a soft, muffled click. The brutal Chicago wind lashed at my exposed face, but the burning adrenaline masked the bitter cold. I walked briskly down the sidewalk, staying within the deep shadows of the towering oak trees. I approached their driveway, scanning the dark perimeter for motion sensor lights. The house was black. Derek and Brittany were undoubtedly asleep inside, dreaming of their escape. I moved silently toward the commuter car parked at the edge of the driveway. The vehicle was covered in a thin layer of winter frost. I crouched down beside the front passenger door, keeping my body hidden from the upper bedroom windows. I took a steadying breath, allowing the freezing air to fill my lungs. I pulled the center punch from my pocket. I positioned the sharp tip directly into the bottom corner of the passenger side window. Tempered glass is designed to withstand massive blunt force in the center, but it is extremely vulnerable to a concentrated point near the structural edge. I braced my left hand against the door frame. With one forceful motion, I drove the punch forward. The glass shattered instantly. It did not break with a loud crash. Instead, it dissolved into thousands of tiny cubes with a heavy crumbling sound, like a bag of gravel spilling onto the pavement. I waited for 10 agonizing seconds, holding my breath, waiting for a security alarm to blare or a bedroom light to flick on. The house remained dark. The neighborhood remained perfectly silent. I reached through the shattered window, clearing away the remaining loose cubes of safety glass. I unlocked the door from the inside and pulled it open. The interior smelled faintly of stale coffee and old cologne. I leaned inside, working solely by the ambient light of the distant street lamps. I immediately reached for the glove compartment and pressed the latch. It fell open, spilling a disorganized mess of old registration papers, crumpled napkins, and faded toll receipts onto the floor mat. I sifted through the useless clutter, my leather gloves making soft scratching sounds against the dry paper. Nothing. I checked the center console, running my fingers through the cup holders and the small storage bin. I found only spare change and empty wrappers. Frustration began to tightly coil in my chest. What if he had thrown the receipt away? What if he had shredded it with the rest of his financial life? I took a step back, scanning the dark interior. Then I looked down at the passenger floor mat. Tucked partially underneath the edge of the rubber mat, barely visible in the dim light, was a crumpled yellow piece of paper. It looked exactly like a standard carbon copy receipt. I reached down and pulled it free. I carefully smoothed out the wrinkled paper against my leg. I leaned close to the window, catching a faint sliver of amber light from the street lamp above. The bold black ink at the top of the slip was unmistakably clear. Golden Key Jewelers. Below the store name was an itemized description listing a vintage gold and sapphire pendant, followed by a cash payout of $4,000. It was signed with Derek's rushed signature. A cold wave of vindication washed over me. I had the name. I had the location. I folded the yellow receipt perfectly and slid it into my inner breast pocket, securing it against my chest. I closed the car door, leaving the shattered glass scattered across the frosted concrete driveway. I retreated from the property, melting back into the protective shadows of the oak trees. I walked back to my parked sedan, my mind calculating my next move. I needed to wait for the sun to rise, drive directly to Golden Key Jewelers the moment they opened, and demand to buy back Caroline's necklace before it could be melted down or sold to a stranger. I opened the door of my car and slid into the freezing driver's seat. I pulled off my heavy work gloves, my hands shaking slightly from the receding adrenaline. I closed my eyes, resting my head against the cold headrest, preparing to wait out the agonizing hours until morning. Suddenly, the absolute silence of the vehicle was pierced by a sharp, vibrating tone. My cell phone resting in the center console began to ring loudly. I stared at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. It was 3 in the morning. Nobody calls an old man at 3 in the morning with any good news. I took a slow, deep breath, reached out with a trembling hand, and answered the phone. "Hello," I said, my voice sounding incredibly raspy and hollow in the confined space of my freezing vehicle. For a moment, there was nothing but a faint crackle of static on the other end of the line. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, half expecting it to be a wrong number, or worse, some kind of automated spam call, interrupting the most desperate night of my entire life. But then a man cleared his throat. "Mr. Caldwell," the voice asked. It was a deep, gravelly voice tinged with a distinct note of hesitation. "Is this Victor Caldwell?" "Yes, this is Victor," I replied, my grip tightening around the steering wheel. "Who is this? It is 3 o'clock in the morning." I know, and I am so incredibly sorry to disturb you at this hour," the man said quickly, sounding genuinely apologetic. "My name is Mitchell. I am the owner of Golden Key Jewelers." The name of the store hit me like a physical shockwave. My heart instantly leaped into my throat. Golden Key Jewelers. The exact name printed on the crumpled yellow carbon receipt, resting securely inside my inner breast pocket. Suddenly, the bitter cold radiating through the windows of my old sedan completely vanished, replaced by a searing, intense heat that rushed straight to my face. I sat up perfectly straight in my seat. "Golden Key," I repeated, making sure I had heard him correctly. "You own the pawn shop on the receipt?" "Yes, sir," Mitchell said. "I run the appraisal counter. I know it is extremely late, but I am still here at the shop doing my end-of-the-month inventory audits. I have a policy of thoroughly inspecting every single high-value item that comes across my counter before I process the final paperwork and lock it away in the main vault. I was examining a specific piece that came in yesterday afternoon, a vintage gold necklace with a rather remarkable blue sapphire pendant. My breath caught. "My daughter brought that to you," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of raw anger and profound sorrow. "She had absolutely no right to sell it to you. That necklace belonged to my late wife." Mitchell let out a heavy sigh over the phone. "I had a feeling something was not right," he admitted softly. "The young woman who brought it in, she was acting very erratic. She was in a massive hurry, demanding cash on the spot, completely uninterested in negotiating a fair market price for the actual weight of the gold. I see it all the time in my line of work, Mr. Caldwell. Desperate people liquidating family heirlooms for quick money. But that is not why I am calling you right now." I frowned, staring out through the frosted windshield at the dark, empty suburban street. "Then why are you calling me? And how in the world did you get my personal cell phone number?" "When I was inspecting the gold chain. Under my jeweler loupe tonight, I noticed a microscopic serial number laser etched directly into the inside of the main clasp." Mitchell explained, his tone shifting into something much more serious. "It is an old anti-theft tracking method some of the high-end boutique jewelers used back in the late 80s. It took me a few hours of digging through some old manufacturer databases online, but I finally managed to trace that specific serial number back to the original point of sale. The purchase record had your name, your home address, and an old landline number that eventually forwarded me to this cell phone." I was completely silent. The sheer dedication of this total stranger tracking me down in the middle of the night was overwhelming. "I appreciate you taking the time to find me, Mitchell," I said softly. "I really do. I will be at your store the second you open your doors tomorrow morning. I will pay cash. I will pay you exactly whatever you gave my daughter, plus a premium for your trouble. I just need my wife's necklace back." "Mr. Caldwell, please listen to me," Mitchell interrupted, his voice dropping to a hushed, urgent whisper. "You do not understand. I am not calling you just to return the jewelry. When I was polishing the piece under the magnifying lamp, I noticed that the primary setting holding the sapphire was unusually thick. The metal casing around the gemstone felt disproportionately heavy compared to the actual carat size of the jewel. I did not understand what he was getting at. It is custom, I explained, feeling a sudden, inexplicable knot forming in my stomach. I bought it for my wife over 30 years ago for our 20th wedding anniversary. The jeweler in Chicago designed it specifically to be heavy and durable so she could wear it every single day without worrying about damaging it. No, Sir Mitchell insisted, the urgency in his voice spiking sharply. You do not understand. The casing is not just thick for durability. The clasp on the pendant was slightly loose. It looked like the young woman who sold it to me had yanked it aggressively. When I applied a tiny bit of pressure with my micro tools to try and bend the gold back into proper alignment, a hidden mechanical spring suddenly triggered. I stopped breathing. The silence in my car was deafening. The pendant popped open, Mitchell said, his words falling like heavy stones into the quiet night. Mr. Caldwell, the sapphire is not just a setting. It is a sliding lid. The entire pendant is a hollow locket. My mind went blank. That is impossible, I whispered. I bought the necklace 3 decades ago. I held it in my hands 1,000 times. Caroline wore it every single day. It does not open. It opens, Mitchell replied with absolute certainty. You need to come down here to my shop immediately. You will absolutely not believe what is inside. The agonizing hours leading up to dawn felt like wading through a thick, endless ocean of molasses. I sat completely paralyzed in the freezing driver's seat of my car, staring blankly at the digital clock on the dashboard as the green numbers slowly ticked forward. Every single second felt incredibly heavy, burdened by the terrifying implications of the jeweler's midnight phone call. Caroline and I had shared absolutely everything during our 30 years of marriage. We built our entire lives together, navigating every triumph and every tragic loss as a completely united front. The sudden earth-shattering revelation that she possessed a hidden secret compartment inside the very anniversary gift I had personally designed for her was fundamentally incomprehensible. The moment the eastern horizon finally began to bleed with the pale, washed-out light of the freezing Chicago morning, I jammed my key into the ignition. My old engine roared to life, violently shaking off the bitter cold. I pulled out of the dark, deserted suburban neighborhood, leaving the shattered glass of Derek's car far behind me in the driveway. I merged onto the desolate highway, pushing my sedan significantly faster than I normally would. The drive into the city was a complete blur. The towering steel and glass skyscrapers of downtown Chicago loomed over the empty streets, reflecting the harsh morning light. I navigated the familiar city grid until I finally reached the specific commercial district printed on the crumpled yellow receipt. Golden Key Jewelers sat nestled between a high-end boutique and a closed artisan coffee shop. The heavy metal security grates were still securely locked over the large display windows, but I parked my car directly in front of the main entrance anyway. I stepped out onto the freezing sidewalk, pulling my thick winter coat tightly around my chest, and waited with my hands shoved deep into my pockets. Exactly 10 minutes later, a tall, older man wearing a thick wool peacoat and a dark scarf approached the storefront. He carried a heavy ring of brass keys. He stopped when he saw me standing there in the biting wind. Mr. Caldwell, the man asked softly, his breath forming a small white cloud in the freezing air. He looked remarkably exhausted, with deep, dark circles bruising the delicate skin beneath his tired eyes. Yes, I replied, my voice raspy and completely drained of all emotion. I am Victor. You are Mitchell. He nodded solemnly, unlocking the heavy security gate and pushing it upward with a loud metallic rattle. He quickly unlocked the thick glass door and ushered me inside the warm, brightly lit showroom. The shop was immaculate, lined with pristine glass display cases filled with glittering stones and polished gold. He immediately locked the front door behind us, flipped the open sign to closed, and led me directly to the secure appraisal counter located at the far back of the narrow room. "Please have a seat," Mitchell offered, gently gesturing to a tall leather stool. "I can only imagine the sheer amount of stress you have been experiencing since last night." I sat down heavily, my eyes fixed intently on the small black velvet tray resting on the polished glass counter. Mitchell stepped behind the counter, opened a heavy steel floor safe, and retrieved a small clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag rested the familiar heavy gold chain and the large, brilliant blue sapphire pendant I had purchased 3 decades ago. Seeing the necklace again, the physical embodiment of my enduring love for Caroline, sent a violent, agonizing wave of grief crashing directly through my chest. I placed my hands flat on the cold glass counter to stop them from trembling. Mitchell carefully slid the necklace out of the bag and placed it gently onto the black velvet tray. "As you can see, Mr. Caldwell, the piece itself is remarkably heavy," Mitchell explained in a quiet, measured tone. "The original craftsman utilized a very specific, highly complex pressure tension system to secure the sapphire within the gold casing. Unless you knew exactly where to apply pressure, you would simply assume the thickness was an aesthetic design choice to give the pendant a substantial, luxurious weight." Mitchell picked up a small, pointed metal jeweler tool. He held the pendant securely in his left hand, the brilliant blue stone catching the harsh overhead light. He pressed the sharp tip of the metal tool into a microscopic, virtually invisible groove located directly beneath the lower clasp. There was a very faint metallic click. It was a sharp mechanical sound that I had absolutely never heard before. Mitchell applied a tiny amount of horizontal pressure with his thumb. The entire face of the pendant, the solid gold rim, and the massive blue sapphire smoothly slid backward on a hidden internal track. I leaned forward, completely captivated and entirely horrified by what I was witnessing. Beneath the sapphire face was a perfectly hollowed-out rectangular chamber. Mitchell carefully tilted the pendant forward over the black velvet tray. 2 tiny objects slipped out of the hidden gold chamber and fell softly onto the dark fabric. The first object was a minuscule, precision-cut metal key. It looked exactly like a specialized safety deposit box key. The second object was a tiny, tightly rolled scrap of thin white paper. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely coordinate my stiff fingers. I reached out and gently picked up the tiny roll of paper. I carefully unrolled the scrap. The handwriting was unmistakably Caroline's, but the strokes were incredibly frantic and wildly erratic, completely lacking her usual graceful precision. The dark ink was slightly smudged, as if her hand had been trembling wildly when she quickly wrote the words. I stared down at the small scrap of paper, my old heart hammering a terrifying, violent rhythm against my ribs. "First Heritage Bank," the frantic note read, "Box 402. If anything happens to me, do absolutely not trust them at all." Caroline's frantic warning washed over me like a tidal wave of ice. I stared at the tiny wrinkled scrap of paper resting on the black velvet tray, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of her secret. My late wife, the woman who had spent her life fiercely protecting our daughter, had left behind a desperate hidden message specifically warning me against her. My mind spun, but nothing made sense. I thanked Mitchell for his incredible diligence, my voice completely devoid of emotion, and ran out of the jewelry shop. The bitter morning wind whipped against my face as I climbed into my car. I slammed my foot on the accelerator. First Heritage Bank was located just 4 miles away in the downtown financial district. The short drive felt like a terrifying blur of gray buildings. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white, while my brain feverishly replayed every single interaction I had shared with Brittany and Derek over the past few weeks. The dramatic tears, the sudden rush to handle funeral arrangements, the aggressive push to consolidate finances, and now the shredded documents and secret flights. It was a massive, orchestrated illusion designed to keep me completely docile. I swerved into a parking space in front of First Heritage Bank. The glass doors had just opened. I rushed inside, ignoring the quiet hum of the tellers, and marched directly toward the secure safety deposit vault, located at the far end of the granite floor. A sharply dressed bank manager looked up, his polite smile faltering slightly as he registered my frantic look. "I need to access a box immediately," I stated, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet, cavernous space. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my driver license, placing it firmly on the wooden desk. The manager quickly inspected my identification and looked back up at me. "Of course, Mr. Caldwell," the manager said, typing rapidly on his computer keyboard. "Let me just verify the access records for your account." I stood there, shifting my weight from one foot to the other, fighting the overwhelming urge to scream at him to hurry. The seconds dragged by at an agonizing pace. He clicked his mouse, frowned slightly, and turned the monitor. "I see here that box 402 is jointly registered under your name, and Caroline Caldwell." He confirmed, completely unaware of the massive storm raging inside my chest. "I have the key right here," I replied, holding up the tiny precision-cut piece of metal Mitchell had given me. The manager nodded, stood up from his desk, and gestured for me to follow him toward the heavy steel gates of the primary vault. He swiped a security card, typed a numerical code into the wall keypad, and pulled the massive metal door open with a loud, echoing groan. We stepped into the heavily fortified room. The air inside the vault was noticeably cooler, smelling faintly of old paper and sterile metallic dust. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with hundreds of identical shiny silver doors. The manager led me down the narrow, brightly lit aisle until we finally stopped right in front of a small door stamped with the number 402. He inserted his master key into the primary lock and turned it smoothly. I stepped forward with a trembling hand and slid the tiny metal key from the hidden pendant directly into the secondary slot. I turned my wrist. A heavy, satisfying click echoed in the quiet space as the internal locking mechanism finally released. The manager pulled the narrow metal drawer from the wall, handed it to me carefully, and pointed toward a row of small enclosed privacy booths located just outside the main vault area. "I will leave you to your business, Mr. Caldwell," he murmured respectfully, stepping back to give me space. I carried the heavy steel box into the small soundproof viewing room and closed the wooden door firmly behind me. The tiny room was completely silent, isolated from the rest of the busy world. I placed the cold metal drawer onto the center of the wooden table and stared at it for a long, terrifying moment. My breathing felt incredibly shallow. This was it. This was the exact moment my entire reality would permanently shatter. I slowly reached out and flipped the metal lid open. The box was not filled with hidden cash jewelry or complex legal deeds. It contained only two distinct objects resting quietly on the bare metal bottom. The first item was a standard black USB flash drive. The second item was a small, beautifully worn leather-bound book. I immediately recognized the delicate, intricate tooling on the dark brown cover. It was Caroline's private journal. She had kept a personal diary for as long as I had known her, always writing quietly, in the evenings before bed, but I had absolutely never read a single word of it, out of profound respect for her privacy. Now it was locked away in a hidden vault, fiercely protected by a secret key she hid inside her favorite piece of jewelry. My hands shook violently as I reached into the cold metal box and pulled the heavy leather diary out into the bright light of the viewing room. The soft cover felt familiar and warm against my fingertips. I sat down heavily in the chair, staring down at the thick book resting on the table. My heart pounded against my ribs. I slowly hooked my thumb under the front cover and gently flipped the thick leather open to the very first page. I took a deep breath, letting my eyes adjust to her graceful, slanted handwriting flowing across the crisp white paper. The single line of text, written at the very top of the page, froze the blood instantly in my veins. "I found out what Brittany and Derek did to Victor. I am confronting them tonight." I stared at those devastating words, completely paralyzed. The heavy vault door, the hum of the bank, and the passing of time all vanished. My trembling fingers traced the delicate blue ink on the thick paper. Caroline had written this. My sweet, fiercely protective wife had uncovered a terrifying truth and documented it right here in the cold solitude of a bank vault. I wiped a sudden tear from my cheek, my vision blurring slightly, as I forced myself to continue reading her elegant, slanted handwriting. The entry was dated exactly 2 months ago. It began with a simple explanation of a restless night. She wrote that I had been out of town inspecting a bridge construction project in Seattle. She had woken up at 2 in the morning feeling incredibly thirsty and decided to go down to the kitchen for a glass of water. As she walked down the carpeted hallway, she noticed a faint, flickering light coming from beneath the heavy wooden door of my private home office. She knew I was thousands of miles away. She assumed it was a burglar. Caroline wrote that she had quietly crept closer, intending to call the police from the kitchen phone, but then she heard familiar voices. It was our daughter Brittany and her husband Derek. My chest tightened as I read Caroline's vivid, horrified description of that night. She had hidden in the dark shadows of the hallway, peering through the slight crack in the door. She watched them frantically pulling thick files from my locked filing cabinets. Derek was sitting at my large oak desk, illuminated only by the glow of a small flashlight. He was holding a stack of official bank documents and commercial real estate deeds. Brittany was standing nervously by the window, keeping watch. Caroline wrote about how incredibly cold and calculating our daughter sounded. Brittany had whispered to Derek to hurry up, complaining that if my accountants noticed the discrepancy before the end of the fiscal quarter, their entire plan would collapse. I turned the page, the thick paper feeling remarkably heavy in my shaking hands. Caroline had waited in the dark until they finally left the house, driving away silently into the night. The very next morning, armed with the horrible knowledge of their midnight break-in, she had conducted her own private investigation. She went straight to my office and meticulously sifted through the exact same files she had seen them handling. What she discovered was a massive, sophisticated web of absolute deceit. Her handwriting became much more erratic here, conveying a deep, frantic panic. She detailed how Derek and Brittany had completely hijacked my professional identity. They had meticulously forged my signature on multiple high-interest commercial loans. They had used my spotless credit history, my decades of hard-earned financial stability, and the equity of my construction firm to guarantee massive lines of credit. But it did not stop there. Caroline discovered that Derek was funneling all of that borrowed money directly into a series of highly volatile, extremely illegal offshore investments. They were essentially using my name as a flawless, untraceable shield to construct a criminal financial empire. If their shadow company collapsed, or if the federal authorities ever started asking questions, Derek and Brittany would simply walk away completely clean. I would be the one left holding the evidence. I would be the one facing total financial ruin and federal prison. I gasped for air in the tiny, silent viewing room. My own daughter had intentionally set me up to take the fall for a massive international fraud scheme. And my wife had discovered the entire plot entirely on her own. I frantically read the next paragraph. Caroline wrote that her heart was completely broken. She could not comprehend how the little girl we had raised with so much love and endless devotion could turn into such a ruthless, calculating monster. But her primary concern was protecting me. She wrote that she had immediately gathered copies of the forged documents, banking ledgers, and offshore routing numbers. She placed them all onto a single encrypted flash drive. The very same flash drive that was currently sitting right next to the journal on the wooden table. Her final paragraph was written with intense, unwavering determination. She stated that she could not let them destroy my life. She could not let them steal the legacy I had built from nothing. She wrote that Derek and Brittany were coming over for a family dinner that evening. She had decided to confront them privately, to show them the massive pile of evidence she had collected, and demand that they immediately dissolve the fraudulent loans before she took the entire flash drive directly to the police. She wrote that she was terrified of what this would do to our family, but she loved me far too much to stay silent. I reached the bottom of the page. That was it. There were absolutely no more words. The remaining pages of the beautiful leather-bound diary were completely blank. I slowly closed the book, my hands trembling so violently that the heavy cover slammed shut with a sharp, resounding thud. I looked at the specific date clearly written at the very top of that final, devastating entry. It was October the 14th. My blood ran completely cold, freezing completely solid in my tired veins. October the 14th was definitely not just a random autumn day. It was the exact same day I frantically rushed home from the busy airport to find bright emergency medical vehicles parked outside my house. It was the awful day the paramedics told me that my perfectly healthy, vibrant wife had unexpectedly suffered a massive fatal stroke. The horrifying reality crashed down upon me with the absolute brutal, unforgiving force of a collapsing building. It was absolutely not a random medical tragedy. They had murdered her in cold blood to protect their dark, terrible secret. I sat there in the silence, the heavy silence of the private viewing room pressed against my eardrums. I sat completely frozen in the wooden chair, staring at the blank page of the leather-bound diary. My vision blurred with hot, angry tears that stubbornly refused to fall. Caroline had not suffered a spontaneous stroke. My vibrant wife had been silenced permanently and brutally because she dared to stand up to our daughter. The incomprehensible evil of that realization threatened to shatter my mind into a million pieces. I wanted to scream, to flip the heavy wooden table, to tear the steel walls apart with my bare hands. But the cold reality of my situation violently pulled me back to the present. Anger would not save me. Screaming would not bring Carolyn back. I needed undeniable proof of exactly what they had done to us. I needed the full picture of the devastation before they boarded that flight to Belize. I gently closed the soft leather cover of Carolyn's diary and set it aside. I turned my attention to the cold metal drawer resting in the center of the table. The small black USB flash drive lay there, a tiny piece of plastic that held the entirety of my ruined life. I reached down and picked it up. It felt incredibly light, completely disproportionate to the massive gravity of the secrets it contained. I unzipped my worn canvas messenger bag, the one I had hurriedly thrown into my car, and pulled out my laptop. I placed the silver computer on the table, flipped open the screen, and waited for the operating system to boot up. My fingers were stiff as I typed in my password. The bright glow of the monitor cast harsh shadows across the small room. I held my breath, gripping the small drive, and firmly pushed it into the side port of the computer. The system chimed softly, a cheerful sound that felt entirely out of place in this tomb of dark secrets. A small window popped up on the screen displaying a single, meticulously organized folder. Caroline had titled it simply with my name. I double-clicked the icon. The folder expanded, revealing dozens of scanned PDF documents, banking ledgers, and intricate spreadsheets. My late wife had spent her final hours gathering every single piece of the puzzle, ensuring that if anything happened to her, I would find the truth. My hand hovered over the trackpad. I moved the cursor to the first document labeled as a master loan agreement and clicked it open. The high-resolution scan filled my screen. The bold, imposing logo of a major national commercial bank was stamped across the top of the page. Below it was a notarized contract for a massive commercial mortgage. I scanned down to the collateral section, my heart plummeting straight into my stomach. Listed there in stark black text were the exact addresses of the 3 commercial properties I owned in downtown Chicago. I had spent 40 grueling years building those structures. I had sacrificed holidays, weekends, and countless nights of sleep, pouring every ounce of my sweat and blood into acquiring those lots and developing them into thriving, stable assets. They were the absolute cornerstone of my family's generational wealth. According to this document, all 3 properties had been leveraged to their absolute maximum limit. I scrolled down to the signature line. There, executed with terrifying, flawless precision, was my exact signature. Derek and Brittany had completely hijacked my identity, forging my name to steal the literal foundation of my life's work. My chest heaved violently as I quickly closed the document and opened the next file in the directory. This one was a detailed monthly statement from the private wealth management firm that held my personal retirement accounts. I stared at the columns of numbers, a wave of profound nausea washing over me. My entire pension fund, the secure, untouchable safety net I had meticulously funded over 4 decades of manual labor, had been completely drained. The ledger showed a continuous series of massive aggressive wire transfers, routing the funds through a complex web of obscure corporate holding companies. They had completely liquidated my entire future. I pulled up Caroline's master spreadsheet, where she had carefully tracked and summarized the total sum of their fraudulent activities. The final highlighted number at the bottom of the column burned itself permanently into my retinas. $2.5 million. They had successfully taken out $2.5 million in fraudulent loans and completely stolen assets, all executed entirely under my name. My daughter and my son-in-law had transformed me from a comfortable, successful, retired contractor into a completely destitute man shackled with a mountain of insurmountable debt. They had stripped me of my past, my present, and my glorious future, leaving me with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. The offshore accounts, the frantic shredding in the freezing garage, the secret one-way tickets to a non-extradition country. It all perfectly horrifyingly aligned in my mind. They were taking the $2.5 million and vanishing intentionally, leaving me behind to face the catastrophic life-ruining fallout of their massive criminal enterprise. I sat back heavily in the chair, my vision swimming, as the sheer magnitude of the betrayal settled over my shoulders. I reached out to close the spreadsheet. As I moved the cursor, I noticed one final document tucked at the bottom of the folder. It was a scanned copy of a certified letter from the commercial bank. I opened the file. The letter was dated 3 days ago. It was a formal notice of immediate collection. I slowly read the bold red text dominating the absolute center of the page, my breath catching in my dry throat. The warning flashed brightly against the white screen. Due to consecutive missed payments, the total outstanding balance of the $2.5 million commercial debt is now officially in complete default. The sheer weight of that single sentence pressed down upon my chest, like a physical block of concrete. I stared at the glowing screen, my mind completely rejecting the horrifying words presented right in front of my eyes. Default. It was a word I had spent my entire adult life meticulously avoiding, a word that represented absolute failure and utter ruin. I could not simply rely on a scanned letter, even one preserved by my fiercely protective wife. I had to see the actual live numbers for myself. My hands trembled violently over the keyboard as I minimized the PDF document and opened a new internet browser window. I navigated directly to the official commercial banking portal I had used for decades to manage my construction firm and my private accounts. My breathing was ragged and shallow in the quiet, isolated viewing room. I pulled up Caroline's spreadsheet again, carefully highlighting the specific login credentials and secure account routing numbers she had somehow managed to extract from Derek's hidden files. I copied the intricate password, pasted it into the bank portal, and firmly pressed the Enter key. The loading icon spun on the screen for 3 agonizing seconds, teasing me with a fleeting, desperate hope that the credentials would be rejected. Then the secure dashboard materialized. The bright white screen illuminated the dark, cramped room, displaying a financial catastrophe so profound that it made my stomach violently churn. It was all true. Every single terrifying detail Caroline had recorded in her journal was staring right back at me in stark, unforgiving digital numbers. I clicked on the primary portfolio tab, watching in absolute horror as the detailed breakdown of my life's work filled the monitor. The 3 commercial properties I owned in downtown Chicago were officially linked together, cross-collateralized, to secure a massive toxic web of high-interest loans. Those buildings were my legacy. I had laid the literal brick and mortar with my own 2 hands, working through freezing winters and scorching summers to guarantee that my daughter would never have to worry about her financial security. Now the equity was completely gone, completely hollowed out by Derek's ruthless greed. I moved the cursor with a heavy, numb finger and clicked on the tab for my personal pension fund. The account that was supposed to sustain Caroline and me through our twilight years showed a current balance of absolutely zero. Every single cent had been systematically drained, wire transferred in structured increments, specifically designed to avoid triggering automatic federal banking alerts. I felt a cold, clammy sweat break out across my forehead. I navigated to the secure communications inbox located at the top right corner of the banking portal. There was a bold, unread message marked with a severe red exclamation point. I clicked the message open, my eyes scanning the dense, formal legal jargon from the Asset Recovery Department. The bank was not simply issuing a polite warning. They had already initiated the final aggressive stages of asset seizure. The formal foreclosure proceedings were scheduled to begin next Tuesday. I read the date 3 times, the cold reality slowly piercing through my extremely thick cloud of shock. In exactly 5 short days, the bank would officially seize my 3 commercial properties. They would immediately freeze my remaining checking accounts, foreclose on the family home I had lived in for 30 years, and I would be forcibly evicted. At 70 years old, after a lifetime of honest, backbreaking labor, I was going to be left completely homeless on the freezing streets of Chicago. But the sheer terror did not stop at financial ruin. The final paragraph of the bank's message contained a severe warning regarding unusual international routing activity. The rapid, massive transfer of funds to offshore holding companies had triggered an internal fraud investigation. They were preparing to notify federal authorities. Derek and Brittany had meticulously forged my signature on every single digital transfer and paper contract. To the bank, and soon to the federal government, I was the sole mastermind behind a massive illegal laundering scheme. I was facing absolute destitution, and I was staring directly down the barrel of federal fraud charges that would undoubtedly end with me dying in a cold prison cell. I pushed the laptop away, my hands shaking so badly I had to clench them into tight fists and press them hard against my thighs. I leaned back in the wooden chair, staring blankly at the blank wall of the viewing booth as the scattered, jagged pieces of the puzzle finally snapped together with perfect, sickening clarity. The frantic shredding in the garage, the hidden one-way tickets to Belize, the massive shipping container, and the necklace. The absolute final, cruelest piece of their despicable plan suddenly made perfect sense. I thought back to Brittany standing in my foyer just hours ago, crying those huge, theatrical tears. She had looked me directly in the eyes and claimed she needed to sell her mother's beautiful sapphire necklace because the painful memories were simply too much for her fragile, grieving heart to bear. She certainly did not ever sell the necklace out of profound depression or overwhelming grief. She simply sold it out of sheer, absolute, desperate necessity. Derek and Brittany had successfully siphoned $2.5 million of my stolen money into untraceable offshore cryptocurrency accounts, securely locking the massive funds away in a foreign jurisdiction where the American authorities could never reach them. But in their greedy, panicked rush to hide the absolute bulk of the stolen fortune before their scheduled flight, they had made a critical, glaring miscalculation regarding their immediate liquid assets. They had drained the accounts completely dry and found themselves entirely cash poor on the very eve of their escape. Brittany actually pawned her beautiful dead mother's extremely precious anniversary gift simply because they desperately needed a few thousand extra dollars in untraceable petty cash to cover their getaway flight to Central America. I remained perfectly still inside that cramped, sterile viewing room, letting the sheer, unfiltered reality of their monstrous greed wash entirely over me. The scattered puzzle pieces finally formed a complete, undeniable picture. The hurried, secretive packing in the garage, the sudden aggressive push to handle all of my legal affairs, the forged signatures on my commercial properties, the offshore cryptocurrency accounts, and the ultimate sickening insult of selling Caroline's beautiful sapphire necklace for pocket change. They had meticulously engineered a massive, devastating financial collapse and left me standing directly underneath the crushing weight of the falling rubble. But Derek and Brittany had made one catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. They had fundamentally forgotten who they were dealing with. They deeply underestimated the intense, quiet strength required to construct skyscrapers. They entirely overlooked the relentless, unwavering discipline that defined every single aspect of my professional career. They falsely believed my agonizing grief had completely blinded me to reality, rendering me entirely helpless and totally vulnerable to their sinister manipulation. They simply assumed that I would surrender without any form of resistance at all. But they were absolutely catastrophically wrong about my fundamental nature. I was not just a grieving, clueless old widower waiting quietly to fade away. I was a master structural engineer. I had spent 40 grueling years designing, building, and reinforcing massive steel and concrete frameworks to withstand unimaginable amounts of physical stress. When a complex bridge begins to fail, you do not sit down and cry. You immediately assess the critical stress points, you calculate the precise load distribution, and you aggressively reinforce the absolute foundation before the entire structure crashes down into the river below. I wiped my face, my previous feelings of profound sorrow instantly evaporating into a sharp, crystalline, and completely unforgiving clarity. I looked back at the glowing screen of my laptop, treating the terrifying bank statements and the forged mortgage documents as nothing more than a series of deeply flawed architectural blueprints. Derek had built a massive multi-million-dollar house of cards using my identity as the primary load-bearing wall. He assumed I would simply panic collapse under the immense legal pressure and take the absolute full brunt of the federal blame while they safely disappeared into the tropical jungles of Belize. He thought his offshore digital shell game was a flawless, impenetrable fortress. But I now held the master key. I carefully closed the active banking portal, ensuring I left absolutely no digital footprint behind. I right-clicked on Caroline's meticulously organized master folder, copied every single PDF scan, every financial ledger, and every offshore routing number, and securely transferred the entire massive file directory directly onto the hard drive of my encrypted laptop. Once the digital progress bar reached 100%, I safely ejected the small black flash drive and slipped it deep into my inner coat pocket. I then picked up Caroline's beautiful worn leather diary. I ran my thumb gently over the embossed cover one last time, making a silent, solemn promise to my murdered wife that her bravery would absolutely not be in vain. I placed the diary into my canvas messenger bag and walked out of the tiny room. I returned the empty metal drawer to the bank manager, my face a completely blank, unreadable mask. I thanked him for his time, walked out through the heavy glass doors of the bank, and stepped back out into the freezing, chaotic streets of downtown Chicago. The bitter wind whipped violently around my shoulders, but I no longer felt the cold. A fierce, burning heat radiated from deep within my chest. I unlocked my car, climbed into the driver's seat, and immediately locked the doors. I pulled out my cell phone, my hands completely steady for the absolute first time in 24 hours. I scrolled through my contact list until I found the direct private number for Harrison Caldwell. Harrison was my younger brother, but more importantly, he was a senior managing partner at one of the most ruthless, highly respected corporate litigation firms in the entire state of Illinois. We had not spoken frequently since Carolyn passed away, but I knew he would answer. The line rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice echoed through the car speakers. Victor Harrison asked, sounding mildly surprised by the early morning interruption. "Are you all right? You never call me during trial preparation hours." I stared straight ahead through the frosted windshield, watching the busy morning traffic blur past my car. I did not bother with pleasantries or gentle introductions. I needed to move with absolute ruthless speed. Derek and Brittany were planning to leave the country in a matter of hours, and I had to completely sever their escape route before they ever reached the airport. Harrison. "I need you to listen to me very carefully," I stated, my voice ringing with a cold, terrifying authority that I had not utilized in years. I need you to immediately suspend whatever case you are currently working on. I need you to completely clear your entire schedule for the next 3 days. I am driving directly to your downtown office right now, and I am bringing an encrypted hard drive filled with absolute undeniable proof of a massive, highly coordinated international banking fraud. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of Harrison setting his pen down on his wooden desk. "Victor, what exactly are you talking about?" Harrison asked, his professional instincts instantly taking over. "Who committed the fraud?" I took a deep, steadying breath, my eyes locked on the towering steel skyline of the city I had spent my entire life building. "Harrison," I said, my voice completely ice-cold and devoid of any paternal mercy. "Call the Chicago Financial Crimes Unit immediately. I have a $2.5 million wire fraud case, and the primary suspects are fleeing the country in exactly 24 hours. The drive to Harrison's firm took less than 15 minutes, but my mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios. When I walked through the heavy glass doors of his prestigious downtown office, Harrison was already standing in the lobby, flanked by 2 serious-looking men wearing sharp, unassuming suits. They introduced themselves as Detectives Miller and Vance from the Financial Crimes Unit. I did not waste time with formal handshakes or polite greetings. I led them straight into Harrison's private conference room, dropped my messenger bag onto the polished mahogany table, and pulled out my laptop. I inserted the black flash drive, entering the password with steady, determined fingers. The massive screen at the end of the room illuminated with the terrifying blueprint of my daughter's betrayal. I watched the detectives' eyes widen as they scrolled through the meticulous, undeniable evidence Caroline had compiled. The forged mortgage deeds, the offshore wire transfers, the total liquidation of my retirement accounts. It was all laid out with devastating clarity. I then handed them Caroline's leather-bound diary explaining the precise timeline of her sudden, deeply suspicious death. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Harrison took off his glasses violently, rubbing the bridge of his nose, his face pale with a volatile mixture of profound grief and absolute, unadulterated fury. Detective Miller leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together on the polished wood table. He told me that the staggering amount of evidence on the flash drive was extraordinary, more than enough to secure an immediate emergency warrant to freeze their remaining domestic assets and physically ground their passports at the international airport. However, the seasoned detective offered a severe, highly sobering warning. Because Derek and Brittany had spent months meticulously forging my exact signature, a clever, highly paid defense attorney could easily argue that I was actually a willing participant in the scheme, a silent partner desperately trying to escape massive corporate tax liabilities. To completely sever my legal liability and ensure they faced federal prison, the prosecution desperately needed an unprompted, completely organic verbal confession. They needed Derek and Brittany to openly admit clearly on tape that they had solely orchestrated the fraud, forged my name without permission, and intentionally planned to leave me bankrupt. Detective Vance opened a small black aluminum case resting securely on the table. Inside was a collection of intricate, highly advanced audio surveillance equipment. He gently pulled out a microscopic, highly sensitive microphone attached to a remarkably thin, flexible black wire. He asked me directly if I was absolutely entirely prepared to go through with this dangerous operation, sternly warning me that confronting my own flesh and blood would undoubtedly be the most difficult emotional trial of my entire life. I thought of Caroline brutally murdered in her own home for bravely trying to protect me. I thought of the grueling 30 years I spent building a solid legacy for a daughter who viewed me as nothing more than a highly profitable, easily disposable financial asset. I unbuttoned my shirt without a single word of hesitation. The cold adhesive of the tiny microphone burned slightly against my skin as the detective secured it firmly against the absolute center of my chest, weaving the invisible digital transmitter down into the hidden fabric of my leather belt. Harrison placed a reassuring hand heavily on my shoulder, promising that he would be carefully listening to the live audio feed right alongside the tactical police units. The impending plan was incredibly simple, but heavily reliant on perfect execution and absolute emotional control on my part. The detectives would deploy a massive, highly coordinated fleet of unmarked vehicles to completely surround Brittany and Derek's sprawling suburban property. They would establish a secure, invisible tactical perimeter, completely trapping the two of them inside the affluent neighborhood. I was specifically instructed to walk up to the grand front door, use my spare house key to enter the foyer, and confront them directly about the sudden bank foreclosure notices. I had to back them into a desperate psychological corner, completely shattering their arrogant illusion of safety, and physically force them to openly brag about their flawless escape strategy. Once I successfully obtained the absolute verbal confirmation of their extensive financial crimes, I would deliberately say a specific prearranged safe word. The heavily armed tactical units would then immediately breach the front doors and forcefully execute the federal arrest warrants, bringing their entire illicit criminal empire to a sudden violent end. The freezing evening sky had darkened into a deep, incredibly oppressive shade of black by the time I finally turned my vehicle onto their quiet, highly exclusive residential street. The massive houses sat far back from the road, insulated by manicured lawns and towering oak trees. I drove slowly past 3 dark, entirely unassuming sedans parked very discreetly along the curving concrete curb, knowing full well that the tactical police teams were sitting silently inside watching my every single move through heavy tinted glass. I smoothly pulled my car into Brittany's long, elegantly winding driveway. The large industrial moving container had already been hauled completely away, leaving the expansive driveway space entirely empty, except for their sleek silver luxury SUV. The warm, seemingly inviting glow of the interior lights spilled brightly out through the large custom front windows, painting a sickening, deeply ironic portrait of suburban domestic bliss on the absolute eve of their planned tropical getaway. The engine of my car hummed quietly as I firmly shifted the gear stick directly into park. I turned the heavy metal ignition key off, instantly plunging the enclosed cabin into a very heavy ringing silence. My heart hammered a steady, utterly relentless rhythm against the microscopic police wire taped securely to my bare chest. I took one final incredibly deep breath, pulling the freezing night air deeply into my aging lungs. I reached out, grabbed the door handle, and boldly stepped out of the vehicle to finally face the absolute monsters I had raised. The drive to Harrison's firm took less than 15 minutes, but my mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios. When I walked through the heavy glass doors of his prestigious downtown office, Harrison was already standing in the lobby flanked by 2 serious-looking men wearing sharp, unassuming suits. They introduced themselves as Detectives Miller and Vance from the Financial Crimes Unit. I did not waste time with formal handshakes or polite greetings. I led them straight into Harrison's private conference room, dropped my messenger bag onto the polished mahogany table, and pulled out my laptop. I inserted the black flash drive, entering the password with steady, determined fingers. The massive screen at the end of the room illuminated with the terrifying blueprint of my daughter's betrayal. I watched the detective's eyes widen as they scrolled through the meticulous, undeniable evidence Caroline had compiled. The forged mortgage deeds, the offshore wire transfers, the total liquidation of my retirement accounts. It was all laid out with devastating clarity. I then handed them Caroline's leather-bound diary explaining the precise timeline of her sudden, deeply suspicious death. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Harrison took off his glasses violently, rubbing the bridge of his nose, his face pale with a volatile mixture of profound grief and absolute, unadulterated fury. Detective Miller leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together on the polished wood table. He told me that the staggering amount of evidence on the flash drive was extraordinary, more than enough to secure an immediate emergency warrant to freeze their remaining domestic assets and physically ground their passports at the international airport. However, the seasoned detective offered a severe, highly sobering warning. Because Derek and Brittany had spent months meticulously forging my exact signature, a clever, highly paid defense attorney, could easily argue that I was actually a willing participant in the scheme, a silent partner desperately trying to escape massive corporate tax liabilities. To completely sever my legal liability and ensure they faced federal prison, the prosecution desperately needed an unprompted, completely organic verbal confession. They needed Derek and Brittany to openly admit clearly on tape that they had solely orchestrated the fraud, forged my name without permission, and intentionally planned to leave me bankrupt. Detective Vance opened a small black aluminum case resting securely on the table. Inside was a collection of intricate, highly advanced audio surveillance equipment. He gently pulled out a microscopic, highly sensitive microphone attached to a remarkably thin, flexible black wire. He asked me directly if I was absolutely entirely prepared to go through with this dangerous operation, sternly warning me that confronting my own flesh and blood would undoubtedly be the most difficult emotional trial of my entire life. I thought of Caroline brutally murdered in her own home for bravely trying to protect me. I thought of the grueling 30 years I spent building a solid legacy for a daughter who viewed me as nothing more than a highly profitable, easily disposable financial asset. I unbuttoned my shirt without a single word of hesitation. The cold adhesive of the tiny microphone burned slightly against my skin as the detective secured it firmly against the absolute center of my chest, weaving the invisible digital transmitter down into the hidden fabric of my leather belt. Harrison placed a reassuring hand heavily on my shoulder, promising that he would be carefully listening to the live audio feed right alongside the tactical police units. The impending plan was incredibly simple, but heavily reliant on perfect execution and absolute emotional control on my part. The detectives would deploy a massive, highly coordinated fleet of unmarked vehicles to completely surround Brittany and Derek's sprawling suburban property. They would establish a secure, invisible tactical perimeter, completely trapping the two of them inside the affluent neighborhood. I was specifically instructed to walk up to the grand front door, use my spare house key to enter the foyer, and confront them directly about the sudden bank foreclosure notices. I had to back them into a desperate psychological corner, completely shattering their arrogant illusion of safety, and physically force them to openly brag about their flawless escape strategy. Once I successfully obtained the absolute verbal confirmation of their extensive financial crimes, I would deliberately say a specific prearranged safe word. The heavily armed tactical units would then immediately breach the front doors and forcefully execute the federal arrest warrants, bringing their entire illicit criminal empire to a sudden violent end. The freezing evening sky had darkened into a deep, incredibly oppressive shade of black by the time I finally turned my vehicle onto their quiet, highly exclusive residential street. The massive houses sat far back from the road, insulated by manicured lawns and towering oak trees. I drove slowly past 3 dark, entirely unassuming sedans parked very discreetly along the curving concrete curb, knowing full well that the tactical police teams were sitting silently inside watching my every single move through heavy tinted glass. I smoothly pulled my car into Brittany's long, elegantly winding driveway. The large industrial moving container had already been hauled completely away, leaving the expansive driveway space entirely empty, except for their sleek, silver luxury SUV. The warm, seemingly inviting glow of the interior lights spilled brightly out through the large custom front windows, painting a sickening, deeply ironic portrait of suburban domestic bliss on the absolute eve of their planned tropical getaway. The engine of my car hummed quietly as I firmly shifted the gear stick directly into park. I turned the heavy metal ignition key off instantly, plunging the enclosed cabin into a very heavy ringing silence. My heart hammered a steady, utterly relentless rhythm against the microscopic police wire taped securely to my bare chest. I took one final incredibly deep breath, pulling the freezing night air deeply into my aging lungs. I reached out, grabbed the door handle, and boldly stepped out of the vehicle to finally face the absolute monsters I had raised. The freezing wind bit through my thick coat the second my boots hit the concrete driveway. Every step I took toward the custom wooden front door felt like marching toward a terrible execution. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, thumping a relentless rhythm against the microscopic police wire taped to my bare chest. I could feel the digital transmitter resting firmly against my waist, a heavy reminder that a tactical unit of federal detectives was listening to every breath I took. I marched up the stone steps of the grand entryway, ignoring the manicured hedges and expensive outdoor lighting that brilliantly illuminated their massive mansion. I reached the landing and pressed my thumb against the glowing doorbell. A soft, pleasant, melodic chime echoed deep within the quiet house, masking the devastating storm I was about to unleash. I stood there, in the bitter cold, waiting for my daughter to answer. The seconds dragged by at a painfully slow pace. I could hear the muffled sounds of rolling luggage wheels scraping against the hardwood floors inside. Then the deadbolt clicked. The heavy front door swung open, spilling warm light out onto the freezing front porch. Brittany stood perfectly framed in the doorway. She was dressed impeccably for travel, wearing a soft cashmere sweater and expensive designer leggings, looking radiant. Behind her in the foyer sat a towering mountain of premium leather suitcases packed and ready for their final escape. When she saw me standing there, her face transformed into a mask of pure, unadulterated delight. The sheer perfection of her performance was entirely terrifying. "Dad!" She gasped, throwing her hands up to her face in a theatrical display of joyful surprise. "What a wonderful surprise. Did you come all this way just to see us off to Cabo?" Her voice was sugary sweet, dripping with a fake affection that made my stomach violently turn. She stepped forward with her arms wide open, perfectly ready to embrace the man she had callously set up for federal prison. I did not return her smile. I did not speak a single word. I stepped forward, ignoring her outstretched arms, and walked straight past her into the massive foyer. I felt a brief flash of confusion radiate from hers, as my shoulder brushed past hers, but I did not stop moving. My eyes scanned the luxurious interior of the house I had unknowingly financed with my stolen pension. I marched purposefully down the wide lit hallway, my heavy boots thudding loudly against the imported hardwood, heading directly toward the open concept kitchen at the very back. Derek was standing casually near the massive marble kitchen island. He was holding a crystal glass of amber liquor in his left hand, while scrolling idly through his smartphone with his right. He wore a crisp, tailored button-down shirt and a relaxed expression, looking like a wealthy, successful businessman preparing for a well-deserved tropical vacation. He glanced up from his bright screen as I confidently entered the room. His polite, welcoming smile instantly materialized, mirroring the flawless, deceptive charm his wife had just displayed at the main front door. "Victor," Derek said smoothly, raising his crystal glass in a cheerful, impromptu toast. "We were not expecting you tonight. Brittany mentioned you were resting at home. You should have called ahead. We would have poured you a drink to celebrate our trip." Brittany hurried into the kitchen behind me, her high heels clicking rapidly against the floor. "Dad, seriously, is everything all right tonight?" she asked, her voice tinged with a manufactured layer of daughterly concern. "You look a little pale. Are you feeling well enough to be out driving so late at night?" I stopped still, planting my feet firmly onto the tile floor. I stared directly into my daughter's bright, deceitful eyes, searching for even the slightest trace of genuine guilt or hidden remorse. There was nothing. She stared right back at me with the unwavering, terrifying confidence of a completely remorseless predator. I turned my gaze toward Derek, watching him take a slow, arrogant sip of his liquor. They truly believed they had won. They truly believed I was nothing more than a broken, clueless old widower walking blindly into their final farewell. I reached my trembling hand into the inner pocket of my heavy winter coat. My fingers brushed against the cold plastic of the encrypted flash drive, but I pushed past it, grasping the thick stack of folded papers I had printed directly from the bank manager's secure digital portal. I pulled the packet out, clutching the white pages tightly in my right hand. Then I reached into my old canvas messenger bag hanging from my left shoulder. I pulled out Caroline's worn leather-bound diary. I stepped up to the edge of the marble island. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or break down into tears. Instead, I channeled 40 years of unwavering structural discipline, treating the moment with a cold, unforgiving precision. I raised my hand and forcefully dropped the stack of forged commercial mortgage documents, the catastrophic pension liquidation ledgers, and the bright red federal foreclosure notices directly onto the polished marble surface. They landed with a heavy, satisfying slap that echoed across the room. Immediately after, I placed Caroline's diary right on top of the financial ruin, leaving it perfectly centered under the bright overhead kitchen lights. The incredibly thick, suffocating tension in the room shifted almost instantly. The arrogant smile vanished from Derek's face, replaced by a rigid mask of absolute terror. He stared down at the bold red ink of the foreclosure notices, his knuckles turning white as his grip tightened dangerously around his crystal glass. Brittany slowly stepped forward, her eyes locking onto her dead mother's secretive private journal. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble violently at her sides. The sugary, loving facade she had maintained for months shattered into a million pieces. The room plunged into a dead, suffocating silence. I stood perfectly still, letting the absolute gravity of the moment crush whatever pathetic defenses they were desperately trying to formulate. Derek opened his mouth, his jaw working uselessly as he tried to speak, but not a single sound emerged from his dry throat. He simply stared at the bright red foreclosure notices like a man completely condemned. I slowly shifted my gaze to my daughter. Brittany was trembling so violently that the expensive cashmere sweater shook against her shoulders. She took a tiny, hesitant step backward, her eyes darting frantically between the heavy leather diary and my cold, unyielding face. "You thought you were incredibly clever," I began, my voice dangerously low and completely steady. "You honestly believed you could forge my signature, drain my entire life savings, leverage my commercial properties for $2.5 million, and simply fly away to Belize while I took the fall for your massive federal fraud." Derek swallowed hard, finally finding his voice. "Victor, please," he stammered, raising his hands in a weak, defensive posture. "You do not understand the situation. We were in massive debt. We made a few terrible investments, and we just needed a temporary bridge loan to cover the margin calls. We fully intended to pay you back before the bank ever noticed." "Do not dare insult my intelligence, Derek," I snapped, stepping closer to the marble island. "You drained my pension. You set up untraceable offshore cryptocurrency accounts. You packed your entire life into a shipping container and booked one-way tickets under assumed names. You were intentionally leaving me to face absolute financial ruin and federal prison." Brittany suddenly stepped forward, fresh tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Dad," she cried, her voice reaching a shrill, desperate pitch. "It was entirely his idea. Derek forced me to do it. He said we would lose the house. He said we would lose absolutely everything. I was so terrified, Dad. Please, you have to believe me." I looked at the young woman I had raised, feeling nothing but an icy void where my paternal love used to reside. I reached out and rested my hand firmly on the worn leather cover of Caroline's diary. "I do not care about the money anymore, Brittany," I stated, my voice dropping into a harsh, commanding whisper that completely silenced her frantic sobbing. "I care about October the 14th. Brittany flinched, as if I had physically struck her across the face. All the remaining color instantly drained from her skin, leaving her looking completely hollow and deeply terrified. Derek physically stumbled backward, bumping hard against the stainless steel refrigerator, his crystal glass slipping from his sweaty grip and shattering loudly across the tile floor. "Your mother discovered your massive criminal operation the night before she died." I continued relentlessly, ever breaking eye contact with my daughter. She found the forged banking documents in my private office while I was away in Seattle. She meticulously gathered the evidence, locked it securely in a bank vault, and explicitly wrote down that she was confronting the two of you that very evening. I leaned forward, my knuckles resting heavily on the cold marble. "So I am going to ask you this exactly one time, Brittany. What actually happened to my wife on the night of October the 14th? Derek frantically shook his head, his eyes wide with panic. "Do not say a word. Brittany," he pleaded. "He is trying to trap us. Do not say anything." I completely ignored him, focusing the entire weight of my anger directly onto my daughter. The medical examiner said she suffered a massive stroke. I pressed my voice, rising in volume and intense authority. "But your mother was in absolutely perfect health. She never had a single heart issue in her entire life. You were the only two people in the house with her that night. You were the very last people to see her alive. What did you do to her?" Brittany covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, as the immense psychological pressure finally shattered her remaining defenses. She was screaming at us. Brittany wailed the horrific words spilling out of her mouth in a desperate, frantic rush. She found the forged deeds. She laid everything out on the kitchen table and threatened to call the police right then and there. We begged her to listen, but she simply would not shut up. Derek lunged forward, grabbing Brittany's arm to silence her, but she violently shoved him away, completely overcome by the terrifying reality of her own monstrous actions. She started clutching her chest. Brittany screamed, her eyes wide and wild with the horrific memory. She collapsed onto the floor, grasping at her throat, begging us to get her heart medication from the upstairs bathroom. She was crying, "Dad." She was looking right at me, begging me to help her. My breath caught painfully in my throat. I felt my entire world tilt wildly on its axis. "And what did you do?" I whispered, dreading the absolute horror of her answer. Brittany looked at me, her face completely twisted in pure, unadulterated selfishness. "Derek said if she lived, she would ruin us." She confessed, her voice dropping into a chilling, deadened tone. "He said she would send us both to federal prison and destroy our entire lives. We could not let her make that phone call, so we just backed away. We stood there and watched her struggle to breathe. We just walked out the front door, drove back to our house, and let it happen." The absolutely horrific, totally crushing weight of that unimaginable ultimate truth instantly paralyzed the entire room. My aging soul completely shattered into a million tiny, jagged pieces. My own flesh and blood had not just maliciously stolen my money. She had intentionally, coldly, and calculatingly watched her own mother die in absolute unbearable agony on a cold, hardwood floor simply to cover up a cowardly financial bank fraud. I stared into the terrified, weeping eyes of the woman I had once proudly called my daughter, feeling nothing but a frozen wasteland inside my chest. The agonizing confession hung heavily in the stagnant air of the luxurious kitchen, a vile poison that permanently corrupted everything it touched. They had murdered Caroline. It was not a crime of passion or a tragic accident. It was a cold, calculated execution born from pure, unadulterated financial greed. I slowly took a deliberate step backward, creating physical distance between myself and the two murderers standing near the marble island. I looked up toward the high vaulted ceiling and spoke clearly, ensuring my voice resonated into the microscopic transmitter taped securely against my beating heart. "The foundation has completely collapsed," I stated, delivering the tactical safe word with an absolute certainty. For 3 agonizing seconds, absolute silence reclaimed the massive house. Derek and Brittany simply stared at me in total confusion, entirely failing to comprehend the severe implication of my cryptic statement. Then the entire world violently exploded. The heavy custom wooden front door was kicked off its reinforced steel hinges with a deafening, thunderous crash that practically shook the structural framing of the mansion. The sound of heavy tactical boots pounding furiously against the imported hardwood floors echoed through the grand foyer like a relentless mechanical drumbeat. Chicago police officers clad in dark, heavy tactical gear stormed into the house from every conceivable angle. Bright, blinding flashlight beams pierced through the elegant lighting of the kitchen, cutting wildly across the expensive granite countertops and the scattered, deeply incriminating financial documents. Federal agents flooded the room with their weapons drawn and leveled directly at the two people who had so arrogantly believed they were untouchable. The meticulously coordinated raid was absolute perfection. The hidden audio feed had successfully captured every single horrifying detail of their damning confession, providing the undercover detectives with all the necessary legal ammunition to upgrade the massive wire fraud investigation into a full homicide operation. Derek completely lost his mind, the absolute instant the armed tactical officers swarmed into the kitchen space. The arrogant, composed businessman who had so confidently planned a luxurious escape to Central America instantly vanished, replaced by a pathetic, sniveling coward. He dropped heavily onto his knees, his expensive tailored trousers hitting the cold tile floor with a loud thud. He threw his trembling hands high into the air, completely surrendering before a single command was ever shouted. "Please," he wailed, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. "Please, I will give you everything back. I will sign the properties over." It was her idea to let the old woman die. Brittany forced me to do it. "Do not shoot me. I am cooperating." He was sobbing uncontrollably, thick tears streaming down his face, as two heavily armored officers roughly grabbed his arms, hoisted him aggressively to his feet, and tightly secured cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. The metallic click of the locking mechanism sounded incredibly loud, a final definitive period at the absolute end of his criminal career. Brittany did not surrender quietly. When the tactical officers aggressively closed in on her, she transformed into a wild, cornered animal. She thrashed violently against the solid granite island, screaming at the top of her lungs, as an officer forcefully grabbed her shoulders and slammed her firmly against the pristine white drywall. The sheer physical impact knocked the breath completely out of her lungs, but her vile, deeply venomous hatred simply boiled over. She twisted her neck, glaring at me with a demonic, unhinged fury. "You did this!" she screamed hysterically, spitting the vitriolic words directly at my face. "You ruined my entire life. I hate you. I wish you had died instead of her. You miserable, useless old man." Her voice grew increasingly hoarse and broken as the officers forced her hands tightly behind her back, locking the heavy metal cuffs around her wrists with professional, unforgiving precision. She kicked frantically at the kitchen cabinets, desperately trying to cause any physical damage she possibly could. But the officers easily overpowered her, firmly holding her in place against the kitchen wall. She continued to curse my name, her vicious, hateful insults echoing through the very house I had sacrificed everything to build. I stood silently in the center of the chaotic, crowded room, watching the violent arrest unfold with cold, dead eyes. I did not feel an ounce of paternal pity for the struggling woman being restrained by the Chicago police. I did not feel a single shred of remorse for the weeping, pathetic man being patted down for hidden weapons. They were complete strangers to me now. Horrific monsters hiding behind familiar faces. Detective Vance walked calmly through the front door, his sharp eyes surveying the chaotic scene before landing directly on me. He gave a firm, respectful nod of confirmation. The operation was a complete success. Derek and Brittany were not simply facing standard federal fraud charges anymore. Because they had intentionally allowed Caroline to die during the commission of a major felony, the state prosecution would now aggressively pursue first-degree felony manslaughter charges. They were facing decades inside a maximum security federal prison. I watched without blinking as the officers physically dragged my screaming daughter and her sobbing husband down the main hallway, past the towering mountain of expensive leather luggage they would never get to use. They were pushed out through the shattered front entryway and shoved roughly into the back of the waiting police cruisers. The flashing red and blue emergency lights illuminated the freezing suburban street, casting long, haunting shadows across the manicured lawn. I slowly turned my back to the empty kitchen, leaving the scattered mortgage documents and Carolyn's beloved leather diary sitting undisturbed on the marble counter. The massive structural failure was finally complete. The toxic, rotting foundation had been eradicated, and I could finally begin the slow, grueling process of clearing away the heavy wreckage. Exactly 1 month later, the bright morning sun completely flooded the executive boardroom of the downtown commercial bank. I sat firmly in a high-backed leather chair, dressed in a sharp, dark charcoal suit, projecting the absolute, unwavering confidence of a man who had successfully weathered a catastrophic hurricane. Harrison sat directly to my right, meticulously reviewing a thick stack of finalized legal documents, his seasoned litigator eyes scanning every single densely printed paragraph. Across the wide mahogany table sat the senior bank manager, 2 federal fraud investigators, and the chief legal counsel for the financial institution. The atmosphere in the room was no longer suffocating or inherently hostile. Instead, it was filled with a profound, almost deferential respect. The meticulous, heavily encrypted evidence contained on my flash drive, combined with the raw, deeply harrowing details documented in Caroline's leather-bound diary, had completely dismantled the entire criminal narrative Derek and Brittany had so desperately tried to weave. The federal investigators had easily traced every single forged digital signature back to Derek's primary IP address. They had successfully tracked the complex web of offshore cryptocurrency accounts, working in perfect coordination with international authorities to freeze and repatriate every single stolen cent before it could ever be fully laundered. The bank's legal department, terrified of a massive civil lawsuit for their glaring institutional oversight, had moved with unprecedented lightning-fast speed to completely rectify their catastrophic errors. The senior bank manager respectfully slid a finalized, heavily stamped folder across the polished wood table toward me. He offered a deeply apologetic smile, formally confirming that the 3 massive commercial mortgages illegally taken out against my downtown Chicago properties had been entirely voided. The toxic high-interest loans were officially erased from existence, completely restoring the absolute unencumbered equity of my life's hard work. Furthermore, my personal pension fund, the financial bedrock that was supposed to sustain Caroline and me through our twilight years, had been fully reconstituted to its exact original balance. The severe federal fraud charges that had once threatened to completely destroy my reputation and leave me rotting in a cold prison cell had been entirely dropped. My name was completely, undeniably cleared. I picked up the heavy gold pen resting on the table and confidently signed my name on the final line of the exoneration documents, officially closing the most terrifying financial chapter of my entire life. Harrison firmly shook the hands of the bank executives, his professional presence guaranteeing that my interests would remain completely protected moving forward. As we rode the glass elevator down to the main lobby, my brother placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, giving me a silent, deeply meaningful nod of absolute support. We stepped out into the bustling city streets, the roaring sound of morning traffic washing over us. I took a deep, steadying breath of the crisp autumn air. The immense, crushing weight that had physically compressed my chest for the past month was entirely gone, completely lifted by the absolute certainty of justice. Derek and Brittany were currently sitting in separate maximum security federal detention centers, officially denied bail and facing a massive mountain of grand jury indictments for extensive wire fraud, identity theft, and first-degree felony manslaughter. Their arrogant, deeply sinister house of cards had completely violently collapsed, burying them permanently beneath the heavy concrete rubble of their own monstrous greed. Later that same evening, the sprawling suburban neighborhood was incredibly quiet. I stood perfectly still in my own kitchen, listening to the gentle, rhythmic dripping of the coffee maker. The massive house felt vastly different now. It was completely empty, entirely devoid of the vibrant, joyful energy that Caroline had effortlessly brought into every single room. But it no longer felt like a suffocating tomb or a lingering crime scene. It simply felt like a quiet, solid sanctuary. I poured the steaming black liquid into my favorite ceramic mug, feeling the comforting, familiar heat radiate directly through the thick material into my calloused palms. I slowly walked through the silent living room, pushed open the heavy wooden front door, and stepped out onto the expansive front porch. The evening sky was painted in deep bruised shades of violet and burning orange as the sun slowly dipped below the distant horizon line. A cool, refreshing autumn breeze swept gently through the tall oak trees, rustling the fading leaves and carrying the crisp, earthy scent of the changing season. I walked over to the wooden rocking chair, sat down heavily, and stared out at the darkening, incredibly peaceful street. I reached my free hand up toward my collar, slipping my fingers beneath the warm fabric of my cotton shirt. I gently pulled out the delicate silver chain, feeling the familiar heavy weight of the brilliant blue sapphire pendant resting securely against my bare chest. Following their immediate arrest, the federal detectives had successfully recovered Caroline's beautiful anniversary necklace from the downtown pawnshop, treating the precious jewelry as a critical piece of material evidence before finally returning it directly to my hands. The cold, smooth gemstone pressed firmly over my beating heart, an eternal, silent testament to the incredibly brave, fiercely protective woman who had ultimately sacrificed her own life to save mine. I was completely, entirely alone. The absolute reality of my profound isolation was a heavy, undeniable fact. I had permanently lost the beloved wife who had anchored my entire existence, and I had permanently excised the deeply poisoned, treacherous daughter who had callously orchestrated my planned destruction. The family I had spent 40 grueling years building had been completely, violently shattered. But as I sat there watching the vibrant sunset slowly fade into the comforting darkness of the evening, a profound realization settled deep within my bones. I was absolutely not a helpless victim. I had faced the ultimate, most horrifying betrayal imaginable, and I had fundamentally refused to break. I had relied entirely upon the rigorous, unwavering structural discipline of my lifetime profession to meticulously dismantle their criminal empire. I had fiercely, relentlessly protected the sacred, honorable legacy of my murdered wife. I had successfully identified the catastrophic, rotting weakness within my own foundation, and I had ruthlessly cut the toxic poison entirely out of my life before it could bring the entire structure crashing down. I raised the ceramic mug to my lips, taking a long, incredibly satisfying sip of the bitter black coffee. I leaned back in the rocking chair, closing my eyes, and finally breathed in the absolute quiet, unbroken peace of a man who had successfully survived the hurricane and completely reclaimed his own world.